We got everybody start taking their seats. We're going to get going here. I call the Committee on Transportation Infrastructure to order. I think we got new mics in here, so is it loud out there? It's good. Everybody can hear us. I can hear him. I woke up to Fazio when I started to speak. Make sure we turn denims off. Again, call the Committee on Transportation Infrastructure to order. Today, the committee will consider H-Res 437, Resolution of Inquiry requesting the President to provide certain documents in the President's possession. H.R. 1735, Community Empowerment for Mitigation Properties Act of 2017. H.R. 3176, Disaster Assistance Fairness and Accountability Act of 2017. And H-Con Res 69, authorizing the use of the Capitol grounds for the District of Columbia Special Olympics Law Enforcement Torch Run. And H.R. 1758, Brownfields Reauthorization Act of 2017. I now recognize Mr. Barletta for a motion.
Pursuant to Rule 1A1 of the Rules of the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, I move that the chairman be authorized to declare recesses during today's markup.
The questions on the motion, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Our first order of business is the consideration of H-Res 437, a resolution of inquiry requesting the President to provide certain documents in the President's possession. I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Economic Development Subcommittee and call up H-Res 437, and that it be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Is there an objection? Without objection, so ordered. I believe a resolution of inquiry is, in this instance, is unnecessary. A significant amount of information has already been provided to minority members, and therefore I do not support this resolution. I now recognize Chairman Barletta to explain the resolution.
Mr. Chairman, I urge the committee report this resolution unfavorably to the House. Many of the questions in the resolution of inquiry have already been asked and answered. Minority members have had 3 briefings that we are aware of with GSA and received responses to at least 8 letters on these topics. In addition, GSA has publicly released thousands of pages of documents pursuant to FOIA requests. Further, we just had a hearing on July 12th with the GSA as a witness, during which members of the committee had the opportunity to ask questions of the acting GSA administrator. Many members did just that. Additionally, as is common practice after hearings, the Democrats requested questions for the record on these matters, which will be sent to GSA for response. But fundamentally, what is this issue all about? A simple disagreement on the interpretation of just 2 words in a contract, admitted to. That's what all this time, briefings, letters, questions for the record, and now this resolution is about. The minority has offered legal experts to support their view, and at the hearing, I pointed to legal experts who believe the contracting officer made the right decision. We can agree to disagree, but the only question should be whether the determination was reasonable, and it clearly was. For all these reasons, I do not support this resolution, and it should be reported unfavorably to the House.
I thank gentlemen. I now recognize Ranking Member DeFazio for a statement.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I will point out that this has historically been a very bipartisan committee. It has serious oversight responsibilities as relates to public buildings, GSA, and taxpayers getting full value for their dollar. In this case, we have the tenant and the landlord are both the President of the United States. There's a profit-sharing agreement. The President has reported profits. The GSA has not reported that the taxpayers have received their share of the profits as under the lease. And I would remind the committee that you're making this partisan, which is very sad to me. I've been on this committee a long time. During the Obama administration in 2012, when the committee was faced with allegations that GSA misspent $800,000 on a conference in Las Vegas, we investigated, requested, and received thousands of documents, held hearings, to hold the relevant GSA officials accountable. In 2011, when the U.S. Securities Exchange Commission was accused of signing a sole source lease for $500 million over the course of a weekend, we held bipartisan briefings, hearings, requested and received documents, and ultimately engineered a better deal for taxpayers. In this case, stonewalling and saying that we have received all the documents is inaccurate. The critical thing is the contracting officer who, the day after the election, in an email to either Jared Kushner or Ivanka Trump, talking about his weekend in northern New York State and asking whoever it was out to coffee, said it was nonsense that there was any particular conflict. Ultimately, the same contracting officer made the decision that there was no conflict. But the GSA has refused to release any documents of legal analysis that underlay that decision. And during the hearing, GSA said they did have such documents, but they would only release those documents at the request of the majority. So that's what this is about. We know there are documents that are particularly relevant to two things. One is the issue of the conflict of interest and the actual words of the lease, that no elected official of the United States of America can benefit from such a lease. The compromised contracting officer, who was best buddies with either the daughter or the son-in-law, and pronounced it nonsense from day one, who based his opinion on what? We don't know, because we're not allowed to see those documents. Secondly, the issue of the missing profit share to the United States taxpayers. We would like to see the relevant documents regarding the actual profitability of the hotel and what GSA has determined is an equitable share for the taxpayers, and the fact that that equitable share has been paid. There is no evidence of that whatsoever. So to say that we've received everything we need and that we had some briefings, yeah, we had some briefings, and actually in the first couple of briefings, GSA was really candid and saying, oh yeah, no, this is a big problem. But then after they fired the acting administrator, suddenly that problem went away, and the contracting officer became the supreme ruler of the land with no oversight from the new acting GSA administrator who wants to keep his job. And, we've been stonewalled ever since. So to pretend that somehow this committee has discharged its duties in a nonpartisan way, the way we did just recently on the Obama administration, where we did not cover up when they screwed up on things like this, is really, really a break from the precedent of this committee, and I'm very saddened by this turn of events. With that, I'd yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, gentlemen. Do any of the members wish to be recognized? I think Mr. Johnson's up first. And then Mr. Johnson's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of H-Res 437. This resolution requests that the President transmit to the House of Representatives copies of any document or communication relating to the lease agreement between the Trump Old Post Office, LLC, and the General Services Administration for the redevelopment of the old post office building into the Trump International Hotel. The Trump Old Post Office, LLC, is completely owned and controlled by the President and his 3 oldest children, who have minor interests. The lease agreement between Trump Old Post Office, LLC, and GSA explicitly prohibits any elected official of the U.S. government from serving as a lessee or from obtaining any benefit that may arise from the lease. Specifically, the lease states, quote, no member or delegate to Congress or elected official of the government of the United States or the government of the District of Columbia shall be admitted to any share or part of this lease or to any benefit that may arise therefrom, end quote. So when President Trump was inaugurated on January 20th, 2017, he immediately became in breach of the lease. The clear terminology of the lease, it's a layperson can understand that President Trump is an elected official of the government of the United States of America. He is the top elected official of that government, and he is clearly in violation of the terms of the lease, but not just the terms of the lease, but the emoluments clause of our Constitution, which is what this lease clause seeks to guard against. It does not want to be in a position, the GSA, of aiding and abetting the breach of the emoluments clause or the violation of the emoluments clause of the United States Constitution. That's why this clause is in this agreement. It's a standard clause in all lease agreements that the GSA tenders to tenants. And who makes the decision about whether or not the president is in breach of the lease? Well, it's the contracting officer who works for the GSA who appoints, and the president, who is the lessee, appoints the administrator of the GSA. And also, it means that he's in charge of that contracting officer. So what you have is a bad situation here. The American people see it, feel it, hear it, they know it. And this committee should know it, and that's why this committee should be exercising vigorous oversight. And that's why this committee, being the committee in primary jurisdiction of GSA, should insist that there not be any violations of the lease and that there not be any violations of the Constitution. And so several crucial details about this deal between the Trump Organization and GSA remain unknown to Congress and the American taxpayer. Members of this committee have written to GSA 5 times to get additional information on this lease agreement, and each time GSA has refused to answer the inquiries in full. For example, GSA, despite our request, has not shared the legal opinion of the GSA General Counsel on whether there was a breach of the lease. In another example, the lease agreement requires the Trump Organization to produce several types of documents regularly. These documents have been withheld from this committee. GSA has refused repeatedly to share these documents despite our frequent requests. President Trump is supervising GSA officials negotiating with President Trump's 2 sons, Donald Trump Jr. and Eric Trump, on the meaning of the plain language of the post office lease agreement. And if these same appointed GSA officials who are then refusing to share the requested information with us, if they are not obeying us because they are beholden to the president, we have a problem. This is an unprecedented situation. It requires full transparency, and I expect every member of the committee would support this very reasonable resolution of inquiry. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Now recognizes Mr. Lobiondo.
I'd like to yield my time to Mr. Barletta.
Thank you. Regarding the SEC and the GSA hearings in 2011 and 2012, let's be clear. There is absolutely no evidence of any wrongdoing or illegality in the context of the OPO lease. The questions turn simply on the interpretation of just 2 words in an over 100-page lease document, admitted to. While some interpret that section one way, there are legal experts who interpret it another way, telling me the contracting officer's decision is a reasonable one. And even in those cases, we did not resort to a resolution of inquiry. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Nadler is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to support this resolution of inquiry, which requests documents and legal memoranda related to the Trump Hotel's lease agreement with the government at the old post office in Washington, D.C. One of the primary functions of this committee is to conduct oversight of the General Services Administration and to ensure that lease agreements comply with the law and protect the public interest. The Trump Hotel lease at the old post office presents a number of concerns that should be of interest to the committee. If we allow this lease to stand, particularly without any significant scrutiny, we would be abdicating our responsibility and letting GSA and President Trump violate the law. First, The lease agreement explicitly prohibits any federal elected official from receiving, quote, any share or part of the lease or any benefit that may arise therefrom, close quote. Yet the GSA contracting officer has determined that the Trump Hotel is in full compliance, despite the clear language of the lease that no federal elected official may be a beneficiary of the lease, and the undisputed fact that President Trump is the sole beneficiary of the trust that retains his interest in the hotel. GSA has not shared any legal written opinion to justify this determination and refuses to provide any documents or even to answer questions in personal briefings. There are good reasons why that clause exists in the lease. Federal elected officials, and especially the President, have significant influence over the GSA. The President appoints the GSA administrator and other senior officials who oversee the lease. The President can exercise control over GSA's budget and management. These are clear and obvious conflicts of interest that threaten GSA's ability to enforce the lease in a manner that protects the taxpayers. Second, the lease leads to a clear violation of the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution, which states that the President may not receive anything of value from foreign governments without the consent of Congress. Between October 1st and March 31st, lobbyists working on behalf of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia spent $270,000 on rooms, catering, and parking at the Trump Hotel. In December of last year, Bahraini diplomats moved the country's National Day festivities to the hotel's ballroom. And in February, Kuwait moved its annual gala from the Four Seasons to the Trump Hotel. All of these actions by foreign governments, through the lease, put cash directly into the President's pocket. At a hearing earlier this month, I asked the acting administrator if GSA has evaluated whether or not the lease violates the Emoluments Clause, and he could not answer. Worse, he indicated he wasn't even trying to determine if the lease complies with the Constitution. He just kept repeating that the contracting officer determined that the tenant, Trump, is in compliance with the lease and that GSA's legal department supports that decision. But he would never say that the tenant or the lease is in compliance with the Constitution. He could not provide any written evidence that the lease is legal. He could not directly rebut the clear violations of the Emoluments Clause. He refused to share any documents with this committee that supports GSA's decision, and he wouldn't tell us the basis for the legal department's determination that the lease is legal. Ranking Member DeFazio, Ranking Member Johnson, and other committee leaders have repeatedly requested information from GSA. All of those requests have been denied. In fact, the GSA administrator confirmed that GSA will only respond to requests from Republicans and not from Democrats, which is obviously obnoxious and a clear break from historical norms. This resolution of inquiry requests basic documents that this committee should receive as a routine matter if it involved anyone other than Mr. Trump. If the lease is legal, then the documents should support that assertion. There is no legitimate reason for anyone to oppose this resolution or to deny the committee access to those documents other than to engage in a cover-up. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution of inquiry, to stand with taxpayers, to protect the public interest, and to reject this President's efforts to use his position for private personal gain. But in particular, simply to see the documents that support the assertion by GSA that the President is in compliance with the lease and that the lease is legal. If they have determined that, we should see the basis for that determination. It should not be a military secret. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Other members wish to be heard on our side? Mr. Denham?
Well, I'm certainly surprised by some of the inquiry here, because if you think back a few years ago, not only were there members of both parties at the groundbreaking of the redevelopment here, but many of my friends on the other side of the aisle talked about what a bad deal this was for President Trump, or Mr. Trump at the time, on how he was going to lose money. We were losing $6.5 million. Those of you that held the hearing with me at the old post office know how bad it was run down. $6.5 million, and now under this lease we're making over $3 million and have a percentage of the profits. And let's not forget that after the election, President Obama and the GSA had plenty of opportunity to flush out the lease that they drew up, had plenty of opportunities to go through the lease again after he was president, to release it to anybody they wanted to release it to. In fact, GSA is still run by, because of the slow appointments process, many throughout GSA and OMB are still under the previous administration. So It is disappointing because we worked on this on a very bipartisan level, and it should still be a very bipartisan project that this committee should be very proud of. We took something that was losing $6.5 million for well over a decade annually, and now is turning money back to the federal government. It was a good redevelopment project and one that we should all still be proud of. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Cohen's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Turning money back to the federal government is indeed commendable. Turning money back to the President of the United States is unconstitutional and a violation of the Emoluments Clause. And that's why this resolution of inquiry is here. No person in our government, particularly the President of the United States, should violate the Constitution. No person in our government, particularly the President of the United States, should make money out of their position. When you have the 77% ownership of the hotel and foreign governments have said that they are moving events, as Kuwait did from the Four Seasons to your hotel, and others have, Saudi Arabia has moved $273,000 in one day, or groups associated with Saudi Arabia, and other foreign nationals to curry favor, possibly and most likely with the President, then it is wrong, and it is worthy of a motion of inquiry and all of the due diligence that this committee can give to an investigation of a true gap in our ethics in the federal government. There's no question the old post office needed repairing, but it didn't need to be a conduit for monies to go from foreign governments to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And this committee, as the Judiciary Committee and the Intelligence Committee and the Special Prosecutor, all need to do its due diligence and do what our duty is under the Constitution to see to it that we are operating under the rule of law and for the benefit of the people of the country and not for one particular individual. I do want to praise our chairman, for he has given us the opportunity to present this resolution and Mr. Johnson to present it, and not to do what the Judiciary Committee did yesterday and hijack a motion of inquiry, take it over, and rather than look into the firing of Mr. Comey and what activities Mr. Sessions might have had involved in that and what Mr. Sessions' parameters are under his recusal from anything to do with the election, rather than let that go forward and then vote it down, which would have been appropriate and proper for a majority group to do if they thought it was wrong and unnecessary. Instead, they hijacked it and voted in a motion of inquiry to look into a bunch of issues that are not relevant that took place last year, such as President Bill Clinton, who knew Loretta Lynch, and seeing her plane on a tarmac and going and saying hello and talking with her, in questioning, calling it Tarmac Gate, in questioning, saying that they were criminals. They did everything short of start to chant, "Lock her up." I did not feel yesterday I was in the Judiciary Committee of the United States of America. I felt almost as if I was in the Politburo. And that was wrong. And I commend our chairman for allowing us to present this resolution and have it go forward, not to hijack it, not to use the power of the majority to squelch and eliminate ideas and discussion that might not be agreeable at the present time with the majority. For that, I salute the chairman. For Mr. Johnson, I thank you for bringing this resolution of inquiry. It's important that we do not violate the Emoluments Clause and we proceed under the rule of law. I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. Any other members wish to be heard? Mr. Larson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield my time to Mr. DeFazio.
I'd like to direct a question, since my colleague, Mr. Denham, pointed out and about the redevelopment and the money that's been saved, but there is a profit-sharing component of this lease. Is the gentleman aware of what proceeds have been forwarded under the profit-sharing agreement? That's one of our key questions to the GSA. Are they getting a monthly profit sharing, an annual profit sharing, and what have they received so far? And they're saying that they won't tell us. Are you aware of how much those proceeds have been? Because that's a condition of the lease.
I'm not.
Okay, that's one of the questions we're asking. Reclaiming my time. I mean, I think it's a pretty simple question to get the GSA to answer. It doesn't challenge anybody in any way. We can argue about the Emoluments Clause, but a number of our inquiries here are very, very factually based. No one disagrees that there's a profit sharing, which is somewhat negotiable, to tell the truth, requirement in the lease, and we want to know how it's been calculated and what profits have been shared. And GSA says they will provide that information only to Chairman Barletta, only if he asks for it, and he has not asked for it, so they will not provide it to us. Secondly, we're asking for legal memoranda on which the contracting officer relied. In one of these briefings, GSA said there were legal memoranda provided to the contracting officer on the case, whether or not there was a conflict of interest. And we have asked for those legal memoranda. And again, the acting GSA head said, I will only provide those documents if Chairman Barletta requests them. And Chairman Barletta has not requested them. So that's why we're doing this resolution of inquiry. I mean, we could narrow this down to a few things that we think are of principal interest to the taxpayers of the United States of America regarding the conditions of this lease and whether we are fully protecting our taxpayers and following the law. And GSA has a contracting officer who declared any conflict of interest the day after the election to be nonsense. And then we are not allowed to see what legal basis there was for his ruling. And the GSA administrator said, it's totally up to that guy. I don't review these rulings. I have nothing to say about what the legal memoranda said or whether or not he followed the legal memoranda. We give a lot of discretion to our contracting officers. I just think that raises some questions about this that should be answered and could be simply answered by requesting the legal memoranda on which the ruling was based, requesting the documents regarding profit sharing, and then, beyond that, when you're getting into other things like the emoluments clause, perhaps we have more of a legal argument. But there are some things here that are being ignored. And I would point out that when in recent history, distant history, when Democrats were in charge, that John Bozeman, a member of our committee at the time, now a senator, had serious concerns as ranking member on water about some EPA work in his region. And he did a resolution of inquiry. And the day before we were to consider that in committee, Chairman Oberstar brought in the regional EPA guy and John, and they had a sit down, and basically that guy said, everything you want, you got it. Here's what we'll do, here's what we'll do, here's what we'll do. We'll give it all to you. And the next day, the committee met, and John didn't object when this was reported with no, this was a, what do you call it, no recommendation. They didn't recommend disapproval, and John was satisfied and got the documents. Again, if the majority would request some of the key documents that we're requesting, this wouldn't be necessary, and we could solve this amicably without going through this process. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Graves from Louisiana is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a few quick questions for the subcommittee chairman. I want to make sure I understand this, Mr. Barletta. I want to make sure I understand this. This lease was negotiated under the Obama administration. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
And have there been any changes to this lease since the new administration's come in?
Not that I'm aware of.
And were there any inquiries from the minority prior to the election in regard to this lease?
Not that I'm aware of.
Thank you. Yield the remaining time to Mr. Barletta, should he desire to consume.
Thank the gentleman. Any other? Mr. Garamundi wishes to be recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick comment, then I'd like to pass this off to Mr. Johnson. I think the difference between the initiation of the contract and where we are today is that the leasee became president. I'd like to yield the rest of my time to Mr. Johnson.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman from California. The emoluments clause in Article 1 of the Constitution states that no person holding any office of trust shall, without the consent of Congress, accept any present emolument of any kind whatsoever from any king, prince, or foreign state. And so that's pretty clear, as are the terms of the lease that President Trump signed, and which a contracting officer who is not an attorney just a contracting officer trying to hold on to his job so that he can accumulate enough years for retirement. This contracting officer decided in his legal judgment that there was no breach of the lease and thus no violation of the emoluments clause. If the majority on this committee are satisfied with that legal analysis and are ready to collude and aid and abet the administration, the president, as he violates the emoluments clause, then I think we've reached a bad time in the nation's history. The emoluments clause is clear. It seeks to prevent a situation where a president can own let's say the Trump Hotel, just spitting distance from the White House, and then someone, let's say the Russians, for instance, can decide that they want to rent the top penthouse suite.
Will the gentleman yield for
in just a minute? The Russians, let's say the Russians decide they want to rent the penthouse suite for 365 days at $10 million a night. And the president decides, okay, I'm going to do that, gets the money, receives the profits, and this committee stands back and watches or fails to even know what the terms of that deal are. That's not serving our constitutional responsibility. If, let's say, the Saudis decide that they want to reserve the banquet hall at Trump Tower at $1 million a night for the next 365 days, if this committee, exercising its oversight responsibilities, fails to be aware of that, and the president is in violation of the emoluments clause and nobody says anything about it, then what are we doing to our Constitution? What are we doing to our democracy? Why are we allowing the chief executive of this country to abuse our dear democracy, our dear country? We have a duty and a responsibility as members of Congress to provide a check on the executive branch, the delicate balance, checks and balances that the framers put in place, the judiciary, the executive, the legislative branch, they all are co-equal branches of government and they act as a check on each other. But when one branch, the legislative branch, for instance, fails to balance out as it should, then our whole government and our entire democracy is at risk. So I implore my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to not let this happen. This is beyond partisan politics. Let's rise to the occasion that the framers would be proud to see what we're doing here. And with that, I'll yield back to Mr. Garamendi.
Reclaiming my time, it seems to me that there is no doubt that there are foreign entities, governments, that are utilizing assets that the president owns, and specifically here the Trump Hotel here in town. The question is he benefiting, and is there a question that we need to resolve by getting additional information? Therefore, we ought to approve this resolution and get the information and make some decisions about what comes next. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Mitchell, Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've sat quietly through, I think, 11 privilege resolutions on the floor. I now sit and listen to this discussion, and I will agree with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. Yes, we have a crisis in this nation, and yes, we have a duty. We have a duty to act to address the challenges in this nation. Our health care system that is a disaster, a tax system that is a disincentive to work, deficits that are strangling our country, and an infrastructure that's crushed, that's not working, that this committee is supposed to address. Those are the reasons we're here. Instead, my colleagues have suggested that We already have the Intelligence Committee addressing investigations, Judiciary, Special Investigative Counsel, and we want more investigations because Lord knows this country would be better off if we had more investigations. I'm new here. I didn't come here to spend hours on end listening to one attack after another rather than addressing the problem, delaying things further and further in hopes maybe in 2 years there'll be a change, or maybe in 4 years we can get rid of the current president. We don't have that much time, and I want to understand why it is we're wasting our time, then do something productive. On infrastructure, what do you say we do that today? What do you say we address health care? At some point in time, I will tell you, the American people out there are looking at this place and saying, you know, it's kind of a joke. And it's unfortunate because we have a responsibility. We can do better. I yield back. Thank you, sir.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Capuano is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I agree with all the comments that were just made relative to what's most important, but I actually can chew gum and walk at the same time, and I do think that we need to address all these issues simultaneously. And I want to just point out two things before I yield the rest of my time to my ranking member. Several years ago, I was one of the 4 people that sued President Obama, a Democratic president, because I thought he violated the Constitution when he unilaterally decided to shoot missiles into an independent country of Libya. Whether it was right or wrong, I think Congress had a responsibility to stand up and take a vote on that. So I sued him. We lost, but I tried to do the right thing. Not long after that, the president himself, in an attempt to answer legitimate questions by some people, mostly Mr. Trump himself, he voluntarily signed a public release of his long-form birth certificate to prove that he was indeed an American. Didn't quiet Mr. Trump at the time, but the president tried to do the right thing because a lot of people in the public had legitimate questions. And I want to be clear, this this item that we're voting on today is not an indictment. It is not a conclusion. I would not vote for it otherwise. It is simply a request for information so that we can have legitimate information to base informed decisions on. We can have all the arguments of whether a law was broken or the Constitution was violated later. With that being said, I yield the balance of my time to my ranking member.
Thank the gentleman. Look, we're asking for legal documents. It's not an investigation. We have been told these documents exist. We are told that they were provided to the contracting officer who preempted that by declaring this all nonsense. So I think it would be instructive to see what the legal advice was that was given to the contracting officer before he determined there was no conflict of interest. It's not an investigation. It's just hand over the existing documents, but we're told that they will only do that at the request of the Republican majority, which is a break from the precedent since I've been here in Washington, and perhaps a break from precedent in all history, that only the majority party can request documents from an administration. That's what we're asking for. And secondly, we're asking for any documents that exist regarding the profit-sharing provisions of this lease. If there are existing documents, we want them. If there aren't existing documents, we won't get them, but then we might want to ask, well, what about the profit-sharing condition? I think that's certainly something that the committee should have some interest. I'm sorry, gentleman, Mr. Mitchell left. I would recommend the 3 bills I've introduced with Republican sponsors that would give us $567 billion of real investment in infrastructure, which have seen no action by this committee and no action by any other committee of Congress and no action by the White House, who's now talking about asset recycling. Sell it all and build some more and then sell it again. Yeah, that'll work. So the key thing we're asking for is the provision of the lease, which is standard in every single lease. No member, a delegate to Congress, or elected official of the government of the United States or government of this district shall be admitted to any share or part of this lease. Now, Chairman Barletta read something where someone says, well, he's not being admitted. He wasn't then, an elected official. But then there's the second clause, or to any benefit that may arise therefrom. Or to any benefit that may arise therefrom. That was the key thing for the contracting officer to decide. You know, sure, you can argue the admitted part, but the bottom line here, and someone made some nonsensical statement like, well, we didn't raise any questions when he signed the lease. It's like, well, yeah, no, he wasn't an elected official of the United States. That's the key here, an elected official of the United States. I believe he is, despite the 4 or 5 million illegitimate votes that were cast on the other side, he's still president. And, you know, we want to know what the contracting officer, who started out by saying nonsense and inviting Ivanka or Jared to coffee, did he make a dispassionate, legally based decision in the interests of the taxpayers of the United States of America and enforce the law? And that document exists. We can't see it. That's all we're asking for. If the chairman would ask for it, this whole thing could go away if the chairman would ask for it and share it with us, not just ask for it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman, and at that I recognize Mr. Crawford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield to Mr. Barletta.
Thank you. There is a pending lawsuit. That's number one. Number two, it just seems that we are using the government oversight process for discovery for a pending lawsuit. The whole discussion here today is that for a request for information. The subcommittee will be submitting questions for the record, which the Democrats can submit their questions for the record. I'm missing where they're being denied any information. That is the process we are going through. They've never been denied by my subcommittee, by myself, but I don't believe that we should be using the oversight process for discovery. I don't believe that's the role of this committee.
Would the chairman yield for a second?
No. No.
No. Okay.
So again, I think we've had a hearing. We've submitted many letters. Everybody's been able to ask their questions. They will allow their questions for the record that will be submitted. So I believe that this resolution is premature and unnecessary. Thank you.
Gentleman,
Yield back.
Ms. Brownlee is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time to Mr. Johnson.
I thank the gentlelady. The emoluments clause is not in the Constitution for just because someone decided to stick it in there and it doesn't have any consequence, any meaning. It was put in there to make sure that our elected officials of our federal government are not under the influence, under the financial influence of a foreign power. And so here we have some facts that you can't escape from. I mean, fact is, President Trump, before he was president, purchases a home in foreclosure in Florida, pays $41 million for it. House stays vacant for 4 years, trying to get sold because the president intended on flipping it, but the real estate market was shot and nobody was spending money and nobody wanted to do a $41 million flip. So the house just sat vacant until a Russian oligarch with more money than you can shake a stick at purchased the house for $91 million, a $51 million premium, a profit to the president. The Russian oligarch never even saw the house before he spent that kind of money for it, didn't inspect it. And then later, to show what kind of deal it was, the Russian oligarch leveled the house, never did move into it, destroyed the house, and sold the land. Took a loss, I would assume. You know, now that is something that happened, and now we have a president who is in control of the Trump Hotel, just spitting distance from the White House, foreign governments lined up back to back to exploit the situation, to exploit this lack of oversight by the American government of its president. With that, I will yield back to the gentle lady from California, noting that the gentleman from Tennessee is wanting me to yield, but I can't do that.
Would the gentlelady yield? Thank you. Look, Mr. Chairman, and Chairman Barletta, since I will yield to you for a response, I'm sorry you wouldn't yield to me, but we are going to submit questions to you, which you are going to submit under cover to GSA. GSA was very clear. Only if you ask the question will they answer it. Will you say to GSA that you wish them to answer our questions, that is, provide existing legal documents and a few other things, not asking for any widespread investigation? Will you make it clear that since you're forwarding that, or if you do forward that it is a request from you so that they will actually respond? I'd yield.
It is standard in the cover letter that they answer the submitted questions. You're welcome to ask that question in your...
But reclaiming my time, the acting GSA administrator who was appointed to replace the guy who was fired because, under suspicious circumstances, said very clearly he will not provide existing legal documents that advised the contracting officer unless you request them. My question is, will you make it clear to GSA that this is a request from you and you wish them to provide the documents to you and to us? Will you do that?
Please be reminded that the letter comes from me. The questions that will be submitted will come from the chairman of the subcommittee, which will be signed by me. I think we've allowed all the questions and discovery that you needed, they've asked for and gone beyond. I believe it's premature for us to be spending time here today.
Well, just reclaiming my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just hope that actually means that they will provide existing documents, because it's an insult to this committee that we can't see existing documents, not just the Democrats, to every member of this committee, that the bureaucrats at GSA are not providing us existing legal documents on which they based a very important opinion. It is an insult to every member of this committee. Thank you.
Like the gentleman, with that, Mr. Farenthold is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to take about 90 seconds to respond to some things the gentleman from Georgia has said. He's spoken as if it's a clear-cut violation of the emoluments clause going on with the Trump Hotel. There's been no real court interpretation of what the emoluments clause means legally, and quite frankly, I don't think many of us here go around using the term emolument on a day-to-day basis. So I took a second to look it up on, I Googled the definition of it. An emolument, whoops, there went my phone. Got to get back to the page. Emolument is a noun. It's a salary or profit from employment or office. And I'm not necessarily sure this includes income from investments. I mean, if you take the argument that Mr. Johnson brought out, it would be like if I were a shareholder in Apple and Vladimir Putin bought an iPhone and I got a dividend from Apple, I was profiting from it. So I don't think we need to, I just want to point out the absurdity of some of that argument. And with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Any other members wish to be heard? I can't recognize you again, Mr. Cohen. Ms. Lawrence is recognized.
Yes, I'm very intrigued by this discussion. I serve on oversight. It is so sad when we as elected officials allow the partisan discussion to overwhelm our responsibility. The responsibility of us as elected officials to ask the questions. We cannot make assumptions that anything illegal has happened. But we do have the responsibility of oversight to ask the question. And what I heard clearly from my ranking member is that if we ask the question, would the chair of the committee submit them to the GSA to obtain those answers. And I just want to be supportive of that request because I am asked constantly, and I don't know about your district, but I'm asked constantly, why aren't we doing anything to provide oversight? Because the question is there. It does not look like it is in compliance to a president having a contract with himself, meaning the government of the United States, and making profit off of that. I can't answer that because we have refused to get or whoever, someone's refusing. If it's GSA, we are the Congress of the United States. We should be getting answers. And if it is the lack of us as a body, Congress, asking those questions, there are some real concerns there. And I'm saying, whether you're a Democrat or whether you're a Republican, you're elected and we all take the same oath to serve and protect, and in this committee, having oversight to ask the question. And I would really implore my colleagues for us to work together on this so we can answer the questions to the public. We can look our constituents in the face and say we did our job and that we have gotten the information and it has been proven that there is no violation. Thank you, and I would yield back to my colleague.
Thank you very much. I think one question we should ask, and if anybody knows the answer, I wish they would offer it here. I believe when this contract was entered into, the Trump family said, or Mr. Trump said, the president, that they would donate any profits from foreign governments to, I believe, back to the government. It might have been to charity. Does anyone know, and this committee should know, if they have given any of the foreign government profits to anyone other than Donald Jr., Donald Sr., or Eric? If nobody on this committee knows, we need to ask. That was something they offered. They said they would do in good faith, and if they haven't done it, it was not done in good faith, and they have conned the American public and the GSA.
Thank you, gentlemen. Seeing no other members wish to be heard.
And can I take the rest of my time, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
The other thing I want to be very clear on, when we are confronted every single day with a new issue, transgender, attacks on or comments being made about our Attorney General, there's a lot of things happening. If we could clear up just one of these items, wouldn't that be a step forward? And that's something that we could do here. If we could say that we asked the question, we request the GSA to comply, and if there is no violations, that's one thing we can say that we did as a body. And I would say, why wouldn't we do that? Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. Seeing no other members wish to be recognized, we'll now consider the resolution for amendment. Are there any amendments to the resolution? Seeing none, I recognize Mr. Barletta for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H Resolution 437 be reported unfavorably to the House.
The question is on the motion. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay.
No.
As opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. The gentleman has requested a roll call vote. A sufficient number of members are requesting a roll call vote, and pursuant to Rule 5E of the Rules of Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll on reporting the resolution unfavorably.
Mr. Schuster.
Aye.
Mr. Schuster votes aye. Mr. DeFazio. Mr. DeFazio votes no. Mr. Young. Ms. Norton. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Duncan votes aye. Mr. Nadler. No. Mr. Nadler votes no. Mr. Lobiondo. Mr. Lobiondo votes aye. Ms. Johnson of Texas. Ms. Johnson votes no. Mr. Graves of Missouri. Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Cummings. Mr. Hunter. Mr. Hunter votes aye. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Crawford. Mr. Crawford votes aye. Mr. Capuano. Mr. Barletta. Mr. Barletta votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano. Mr. Farenthold.
Aye.
Mr. Farenthold votes aye. Mr. Lipinski. Mr. Lipinski votes no. Mr. Gibbs. Mr. Gibbs votes aye. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes yes. Mr. Sears? Mr. Sears votes no. Mr. Denham? Mr. Denham votes aye. Mr. Garamendi? Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Massey? Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Meadows? Mr. Meadows votes aye. Mr. Carson? Mr. Perry? Mr. Perry votes aye. Mr. Nolan? Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis votes aye. Ms. Titus? Ms. Titus votes no. Mr. Sanford? Mr. Maloney?
No.
Mr. Maloney votes no. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall votes yes. Ms. Esty? Ms. Esty votes no. Mr. Rokita? Mr. Rokita votes aye. Ms. Frankel? Ms. Frankel votes no. Mr. Katko? Mr. Katko votes aye. Ms. Bustos? Ms. Bustos votes no. Mr. Babin? Mr. Babin votes yes. Mr. Huffman? Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. Graves of Louisiana? Mr. Graves votes yes. Ms. Brownlee? Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mrs. Comstock? Mrs. Comstock votes yes. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Mr. Rouser? Mr. Rouser votes aye. Mr. Payne? Mr. Payne votes no. Mr. Bost? Mr. Bost votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal? Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Weber? Mr. Weber votes aye. Mrs. Lawrence? Mrs. Lawrence votes no. Mr. LaMalfa? Mr. LaMalfa votes aye. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier votes no. Mr. Schmucker? Mr. Schmucker votes aye. Mr. Westerman? Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mr. Mitchell? Mr. Mitchell votes aye. Mr. Faso? Mr. Faso votes aye. Mr. Ferguson? Mr. Ferguson votes aye. Mr. Mast? Mr. Mast votes aye. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Lewis votes aye.
Any other members wish to be recorded? Mr. Cohen?
No.
Mr. Cohen votes no.
Ms. Norton, how's she recorded?
She is not recorded.
I vote no.
Ms. Norton votes no.
How's Mr. Capuano recorded?
He is not recorded. Mr. Capuano votes no.
Any other members?
Mr. Sanford?
Oh, Mr. Sanford.
Mr. Sanford votes no.
Any other members wish to be recorded? Seeing none, all members have cast their vote. The clerk will report the vote.
On this vote, the yeas are 31, the nays are 24.
The motion to report the resolution unfavorably is agreed to. We will now consider H.R. 1735, the Community Empowerment for Mitigated Properties Act of 2017. I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Economic Development Subcommittee, call up H.R. 1735, and that is to be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Is there an objection? Without an objection, so ordered. H.R. 1735 directs the FEMA administrator to issue guidance regarding the maintenance of property obtained as part of flood hazard mitigation program. I want to thank Dr. Babin for his working with the committee on this bipartisan and common sense bill. I urge all members to support. I recognize Subcommittee Chairman Barletta to explain the bill.
H.R. 1735, the Community Empowerment for Mitigated Properties Act of 2017, requires the FEMA administrator to issue guidance to state and local governments for establishing the upkeep and maintenance of properties purchased with hazard mitigation funds. As a former mayor, I know all too well what a burden a property can be when it is flooded year after year. But I also know what an eyesore, an unmaintained, overgrown, empty lot can be. Dr. Babin is to be commended for introducing this legislation that not only supports mitigation, but helps ensure those properties are properly maintained. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen. Now I recognize Ranking Member of the Subcommittee, Mr. Johnson, for statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support H.R. 1735, which requires the administrator of the Federal Emergency Management Agency to issue guidance related to property acquisitions made under the Hazard Mitigation Grant Fund. Local governments should be informed when properties in their jurisdictions have been purchased and must be used as open space so that the local government can ensure that the property is properly maintained. I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Any other members wish to be heard? Seeing none, we will consider open for amendment. Are there any amendments? I believe Mr. Dr. Babin has an amendment at the desk.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. I have an amendment at the desk, Babin 38. I ask unanimous consent for the amendment to be considered as read.
Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 38, offered by Mr. Babin.
Mr. Babin is now recognized to speak on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment simply makes technical and conforming changes to the bill, ensuring that certain phrases and terms are in sync with the Stafford Act and other applicable statutes. I'm pleased to say that upon adoption of this amendment, we will be able to pass H.R. 1735 out of the committee with strong bipartisan support, and I'd like to thank the chairman, ranking members, and their staffs for helping to make that happen today. I'd also like to thank my Texas colleague, Ms. Eddie Bernice Johnson, for her co-sponsorship, making this a bipartisan bill that will be good for our state and our country. When FEMA buys up repeatedly flooded residential lots, the houses are demolished, the properties are permanently barred from development, the properties become open lots and become future floodwaters and give future floodwaters a place to be absorbed into the ground. But the strict requirements and regulations on development of the land can leave a patchwork of empty spaces and uncertainty about who is responsible for their upkeep and maintenance. This legislation would ensure that FEMA provides notice to municipal land maintenance authorities that a flood mitigation purchase has been made inside their jurisdiction and sets up a process for mediating disagreements between local governments' competing land maintenance standards. Enactment of this legislation would help communities in my district and around the country to better deal with these situations, and I look forward to advancing it through this committee today and on to the full House. And I urge the support for the, of my bill, of this amendment to this bill, and yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen. Any other members wish to be heard? Mr. Johnson is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support this amendment to H.R. 1735 to ensure that any recommendations for a memorandum of agreement requires the purchased property to be used and maintained consistent with its existing law and to make technical corrections. With that, I urge my colleagues to support the bill and yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Any other members wish to be heard? Seeing none, are there amendments to the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. We will now consider H.R. 3176, the Disaster Assistance, Fairness, and Accountability Act of 2017. I ask unanimous Yep. Are there any other members of the amendment? If not, I recognize Mr. Barletta for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 1735 as amended be approved and reported favorably to the House.
Questions on the motion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. The bill is amended and approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. We will now consider H.R. 3176, the Disaster Assistance, Fairness, and Accountability Act of 2017. I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Economic Development Subcommittee and call up H.R. 3176, and that it be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Is there an objection? Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize Chairman Barletta to explain the bill.
H.R. 3176, the Disaster Assistance, Fairness, and Accountability Act of 2014 puts a statute of limitations on FEMA's recovery of disaster assistance payments from individuals. This bill protects people who, through no fault of their own, received inaccurate disaster assistance from FEMA. FEMA will have 3 years to correct those mistakes and recover funds from individuals, but not beyond 3 years. It is important to note this statute of limitations does not apply in the event of fraud, nor does it limit FEMA's ability to recover such funds. I urge my colleagues to support this bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize Mr. Johnson for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support H.R. 3176, the Disaster Assistance and Fairness Accountability Act of 2017, to establish a 3-year statute of limitations on when the Federal Emergency Management Agency may recover improperly made individual assistance payments. Similar to the public assistance issue the committee addressed a few months ago, we have a framework where FEMA provides federal disaster assistance to individuals, and later FEMA determines that it made a mistake, and after the individual has spent the funds, FEMA comes along to try to take it back. Imposing a 3-year statute of limitations makes sense in this situation. Our constituents should not have to look over their shoulders indefinitely, wondering if FEMA will change its mind and try to reclaim funds spent years earlier. I commend Mr. Meeks for bringing this matter to our attention last Congress and earlier this year. I also thank Mr. MacArthur for his efforts today, and I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Any other members wish to be heard? Seeing none, they will now consider the bill for amendment. Mr. Barletta is recognized for an amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk asking unanimous consent that the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection, the clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 21 offered by Mr. Barletta.
Mr. Barletta is recognized to explain his amendment.
This amendment makes clear that there is no statute of limitations in cases where there is evidence of civil or criminal fraud. We absolutely want the federal government to go after every dime that was obtained through fraud or spent fraudulently. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Anybody else wish to be heard on the amendment? Mr. Johnson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of the Barletta amendment to H.R. 3176, which clarifies and makes clear that the 3-year statute of limitations does not apply in instances of fraud. And I urge my colleagues to support the amendment and the underlying bill, and with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Are there any amendments to the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments? Seeing none, I recognize Mr. Barletta for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 3176 as amended be approved and reported favorably to the House.
The question is on the motion. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. The bill is amended and is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. We will now consider H-Con Res 69, authorizing the use of the Capitol grounds for the District of Columbia Special Olympics Law Enforcement Torch Run. I ask for unanimous consent to discharge the Economic Development Subcommittee and call up H-Con Res 69, and that it be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Is there an objection? Without objection, so ordered. H-Con Res 69 authorizes the use of the Capitol grounds for the District of Columbia Special Olympics Law Enforcement Torch Run. This event is held in October and will honor local Special Olympic athletes. I support this resolution, and I recognize Mr. Barletta to explain his...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Concurrent Resolution 69 would authorize the use of the Capitol grounds for the 32nd Annual Law Enforcement Torch Run. This run, involving approximately 1,000 law enforcement officials, benefits the Special Olympics of the District of Columbia. This is a Capitol grounds resolution we do annually, and I appreciate Ms. Norton's work on it to help honor these individuals. I support favorably reporting this resolution.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Johnson is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I speak in support of House Concurrent Resolution 69, which authorizes use of the Capitol grounds for the 32nd Annual Law Enforcement Torch Run, which benefits the District of Columbia Special Olympics program. The Torch Run has become a popular event on Capitol Hill and an integral component of the fundraising efforts for the D.C. Special Olympics. This event supports year-round sports and fitness activities, health screenings, and athletic competition for adults and children with intellectual disabilities. All programs offered to Special Olympics athletes are always free of charge. The Torch Run is an important show of inclusiveness for Special Olympics athletes, and I'm pleased to support such a worthwhile organization and event. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting the passage of this resolution, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. We'll now consider the bill for amendment. Seeing none, I recognize Mr. Barletta for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H-Con Res 69 be approved and reported favorably to the House.
Questions on the motion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. The resolution is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. We will next consider H.R. 1758, the Brownfields Reauthorization Act of 2017. I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Water Resources Subcommittee and call up H.R. 1758, and that it be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Is there an objection? Without objection, so ordered. I want to thank Vice Ranking Member Esty and Mr. Katko, Ranking Members DeFazio and Napolitano, and the Subcommittee Chairman Graves for their work on this issue. There are hundreds of thousands of brownfield sites in both rural and urban areas across the country, areas that are often prime locations for redevelopment. Today's bill continues to assert the committee's important role in helping to revitalize these sites in our communities. I now turn to the Subcommittee Chairman Graves from Louisiana to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Vice Ranking Member Esty and Mr. Katko for their hard work on this bill, and all the members of the full committee and subcommittee to get to a bipartisan resolution. I'm glad we can come together in this legislation. I appreciate everyone's work. Mr. Chairman, brownfields are properties where contamination is suspected but unknown. The fear of environmental liability and uncertainty causes developers to leave these properties out of development plans, and it results in blighted properties, it results in driving down property values, it results in lack of opportunity for cities to generate tax revenues and contribute to the economy. In 2001, Congress recognized this problem and created specific authority for dealing with brownfields, providing funds to the EPA for assessments, for cleanups, providing targeted liability relief, and increased federal support for state and tribal programs that were already underway. It created more certainty. As of this year, the EPA, state, and tribal programs have assessed more than 25,000 properties, completed over 100,000 cleanups, and made more than 1 million acres of property ready for reuse. Benefits of having these sites redeveloped have increased property values between 5 and 15% and measurable environmental benefits. Additionally, between $16 and $17 have been leveraged for every $1 in federal funds that have been provided through this program, and nearly 120,000 jobs have been supported as a result. The authorization for brownfield grants expired at the end of fiscal year 2006. Moving the bill today, along with the amendments worked out by Mr. Katko and Vice Ranking Member Esty, will make some important updates to the program, such as providing additional clarification regarding the targeted liability relief I mentioned earlier, creating a new multi-purpose grant that can be used for both assessment and cleanups of sites, getting redevelopment done sooner, expanding eligibility for grants to nonprofit organizations, and renewing our commitment to both federal and state programs. H.R. 1758, the Brownfields Reauthorization Act of 2017, enjoys broad support from 23 organizations, including our mayors, cities, counties, state government officials, private real estate developers, engineers, and non-for-profit entities. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record the list of organizations in support of the Brownfields Reauthorization. Again, I'd like to thank everyone for their hard work on this important issue. Yield back.
Thank the gentleman. With that, it recognizes the Ranking Member DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, Ranking Member Napolitano has very serious family matters to attend to. She can't be here today, but she would be supportive. I would like to congratulate the gentlelady from Connecticut for her persistent work on this issue and her working in a bipartisan way with Chairman Graves and Representative Katko. We had earlier this year where OMB Director Mick Mulvaney suggested the administration should only fund programs that work. Well, this is a program that works and works really, really well. There's a long record of success of bringing underutilized and contaminated lands into productive use, providing jobs, tax revenues, and benefiting the communities and the national economy. I give one brief example I can't resist as chair of the Craft Brewers Caucus, which I believe is now the largest caucus in Congress at 234 members, that the city of Eugene, Oregon got a brownfields grant, and in part, it was used to mitigate an area that was a brownfield upon which now sits the Ninkasi Brewery, one of the now growing, most quickly growing regional breweries in the country, and in fact, it is distributed here in Washington, D.C. There are multiple benefits from this program, and I strongly endorse the legislation. With that, I would yield back, Mr.
Thank the gentleman. Any other members? Ms. Estes is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Schuster and Ranking Member DeFazio. Yes, we have one of those craft breweries too on one of our brownfield sites, so we can be looking for good things. I want to thank my friend and colleague, Representative Katko, and Subcommittee Chairman Graves, as well as Ranking Member Napolitano and Ranking Member DeFazio for their support in this important bipartisan legislation. Today's markup is an important opportunity for this committee to work in a bipartisan way to help communities across the country create good-paying jobs and turn blighted, contaminated properties into public assets. Originally authorized in 2002, the EPA Brownfields program empowers states, communities, and private businesses to assess, clean up, and revitalize brownfield sites. Since the program's original authority expired in 2006, various private sector companies, local officials, and environmental advocates have suggested changes to further our shared goal of revitalizing these properties. That's why Mr. Katko and I reintroduced the Brownfields Reauthorization Act, legislation to authorize the EPA's Brownfields program at $200 million with an additional $50 million for the state response program annually through 2022. I think it's important to note that our bill makes several important improvements to this program, which has proven success. To encourage public-private partnerships, our bill expands eligibility to brownfield grants to certain nonprofits, limited liability partnerships, and community development entities. This expansion includes governments that acquired brownfields prior to 2002, so long as they did not cause or contribute to contamination. Our bill also creates multipurpose grants, which I know in my district have been incredibly important, to fund properties at all stages from start to finish, including inventory, assessment, planning, and remediation. These grants will streamline the process to provide greater certainty of long-term project funding. Redeveloping brownfield sites is one of the best investments we can make in local economies. This has proven to be the case in cities and towns throughout my congressional district in Connecticut, from Waterbury to New Milford to Torrington to Meriden. According to a 2007 study, for every acre of brownfield redevelopment, you create approximately 10 jobs. I want to repeat that. For every acre of brownfields redevelopment, 10 jobs are created. On average, as my friend, the subcommittee chairman Graves noted, for every dollar of federal investment in this program, an additional $18 is leveraged in private and state development. That is an incredible return on investment. This bipartisan bill reflects the input from citizens, environmental advocates, business groups, states, local communities. It is exactly the sort of common sense work that our voters sent us to Washington to do. Passing the Brownfields Authorization Act will empower communities that we represent to turn blighted properties into hubs of economic activity and provide space for outdoor recreation. Quite simply, brownfields represent the ultimate opportunity to recycle a precious resource, land. With over 450,000 brownfield sites across the country, advancing this legislation will demonstrate our shared commitment to creating jobs and strengthening the economies in the communities we represent. Again, I want to thank Representatives Katko and Graves and their staff on both sides of the aisle for hard work on bringing this bill forward today. I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member, and I urge my colleagues to support this important legislation. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. With that, recognize Mr. Katko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk, and I ask unanimous consent the amendment be considered as read.
Gentlemen, we're not in that place yet. You want to speak on the bill, underlying bill?
I'll be ready to speak on the amendment only, sir.
Then with that, Ms. Johnson is recognized on the bill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and ranking member, and those who were involved in the reauthorization of brownfields. As an original co-sponsor of this brownfields program, I can truthfully say that this is an investment that has paid off. To bring many closed buildings with a lot of asbestos and pollution around them back to green fields has been tremendous. If we've invested in any program that has paid off for that investment, it is the Brownfields program. So I congratulate those who are sponsoring reorganization, and I hope to keep using it. Thank you.
Thank the gentlelady. Any other members wish to be heard? Seeing none, we will now consider the bill for amendment. Mr. Katko is recognized.
I know this is shocking, but I have an amendment at the desk. Then I ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, that the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 1 offered by Mr. Katko.
Mr. Katko is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Congresswoman Esty, my friend and partner in this, and for her leadership on this issue. I also want to thank the committee for their efforts, including Chairman Graves of the subcommittee and his staff, who did a wonderful job on this. I grew up in central New York, surrounded by booming industry, and subsequently witnessed the exodus of manufacturing from our region. In the last 20 to 25 years, we've lost 30,000 manufacturing jobs. With that exodus came the realization of the impact that industrial pollution had on our prized lands and waters. The 24th District was and continues to be home to blighted properties and contaminated lands that were once industrial hubs, the most notable site being Onondaga Lake, which, before a tremendous and unbelievably costly cleanup effort, was known as the most polluted lake in the country. The Brownfields program has been pivotal in the redevelopment and reuse of property previously uninhabitable and unusable throughout my district. With brownfield sites in my district such as Syracuse, Auburn, Fulton, Oswego, and Wilkett, this program has spurred job creation, provided recreational opportunities, and has really revitalized many neighborhoods. I'm proud to see this important legislation moving forward to preserve and enhance the Brownfields program. In addition to reauthorizing the program at full funding for an additional 4 years, my amendment includes bipartisan language clarifying liability for local governments and leaseholders and expanding eligibility to assessment and remediation grants, all intended to increase the effectiveness of Brownfields grants, leading to faster cleanups. This legislation will go a long way to not only maintaining this program, but ensuring that more contaminated sites are cleaned up and redeveloped, strengthening communities across our country. Again, I want to thank my colleague, Ms. Esty, and on the others on the committee, and I urge all my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank gentlemen. Any other members wish to be heard on the amendment? Ms. Estes is recognized.
Just want to thank again everyone involved in bringing this forward. We've been working for about 1.5 years, but sometimes good things come after a lot of hard work. So again, thank you to Mr. Katko, to Mr. Graves, to our ranking members, to the chairman, to Ms. Johnson for her work on this for a very long time. And again, we have an opportunity here to do something that hasn't been done since 2006. And I'm proud of the good work everybody's done. I want to thank especially the work of the staff. They've been tremendously helpful, and they often don't get the thanks they should get. So again, thank you all, and I urge support and rapid movement to the floor so we can pass this and get it around for a signature. Thank you very much.
I thank the gentlelady and appreciate Mr. Katko's and Ms. Estes working together to bring this forward. Do any other members wish to be heard on the amendment? Mr. Graves from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Mr. Katko and Vice Ranking Member Esty for their hard work on the amendment. This amendment includes some additional clarifications to the Brownfields law that will help to continue the success of the program. The amendment clarifies liability for government entities, clarifies leaseholder participation in the program, clarifies how brownfields contaminated with petroleum are handled, and makes other technical changes. These edits improve the underlying bill and reflect issues that we learned about at the hearing this year and in previous discussions and meetings with stakeholders. I'm pleased we could come to a bipartisan agreement. Again, want to thank Mr. Katko and Ms. Esty for their hard work, and I urge all members of the committee to support the amendment.
I thank the gentleman. Any other members wish to be heard? Seeing none, are there amendments to the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments? Seeing none, I now recognize Mr. Graves from Louisiana for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 1758 as amended be approved and reported favorably to the House.
Questions on the motion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. The bill is amended and approved in order to report it favorably to the House. Before we adjourn today, I'd like to take a moment to recognize Don Walker, who has been a constant and reassuring feature in Mr. Duncan's office and here on the committee for 23 years. Don has had a hand in many, many major pieces of legislation, particularly while his boss chaired special panels, as well as aviation, water, highways subcommittee for 6 years. Don has been a patient, loyal, and extremely calming presence, not only for Mr. Duncan, but for the committee staff as well. Don and his wife, Polly, are moving back home to Tennessee, where Don will continue to serve in the district office. Don, you will be missed. I think he's in the next room. Oh, there he is. He's right. Don, you will be missed. We wish you the best in your new role, and I know you'll continue to serve Mr. Duncan's district in Tennessee. And with that, I would yield to Mr. Duncan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. That was a very kind thing for you to do. Don has been a very loyal and dedicated employee of mine for 23 years and will continue to work for me. He and his wife, Polly, who has been Senator Burr's scheduler for many, many years, she worked for me. That's where they met in my office, and they want to go home to Tennessee, and so we're working that out for them. Don, my favorite story about Don, he got a master's degree from New York University many years ago, and they asked him why did he go to New York University, and he said it was affirmative action for hillbillies. And so Don is a humble, low-key, but a very competent employee, and he's made a very, very good impression on many, many people in this city, and I appreciate the fact that you're honoring him in this way today, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Again, Don, wish you all the best. I hope you get a new car when you go back to Tennessee. You can probably afford it. You do? Okay. I ask unanimous consent that each bill or resolution order reported today will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute, incorporating any amendments adopted. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make all necessary technical clarifying and conforming changes to each of the bills and resolutions ordered reported today to reflect the actions of the committee. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the chairman, after consultation with the ranking member, has authority to strike or revise any provision of the bills order reported today that will cause a sequential referral to other committee, or that would cause the bills or resolutions to be subject to a Budget Act or Rule 21 CUTCO point of order. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 22, I ask unanimous consent the committee authorize the chairman or his designee to offer such motions as may be necessary in the House to go to conference with the Senate on H.R. 1735 as amended, H.R. 3176 as amended, H.R. 1758 as amended, and order reported by the committee today or similar Senate bills without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to Rule 5 of the Rules of the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, the chair notes the presence of a quorum for actions taken on all committee business today. With that, the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure completed its business today, and the committee is adjourned.